3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions against the starting defense. Let that sit for a second, because that is not a stat line from a preseason game where the outcome does not matter. That is not garbage time padding against backups trying to keep their roster spots. That is a rookie quarterback. In the middle of the most controversial training camp competition the Cleveland Browns have run in years, stepping into first-team reps against the best defense this roster can put on the field, and absolutely delivering. And here is the part that makes today even more fascinating. Less than a week ago, Shedeur Sanders had his first-team reps quietly pulled away from him. No dramatic announcement, no press conference explanation, just gone. And the media narrative surrounding this entire quarterback competition shifted almost overnight in a direction that had a lot of people seriously asking whether this thing was ever actually open to begin with. But then today happened, and today said everything that needed to be said, louder than any insider rumor or national report ever could. There is also a local Cleveland radio conversation that went completely viral in the right circles today. And once you hear what was actually said, you will understand exactly why Browns fans are losing their minds right now. Drop one word in the comments right now: earned or rigged. Because after what you are about to hear, you are going to have a very strong opinion on which one describes this competition better. Before moving further, we're pushing for 1,000 subscribers here at Gridiron Ground. If you're enjoying our Browns and Shedeur Sanders coverage, hit that subscribe button and be part of the journey. Let's build this community together. The very first throw of practice set the tone for everything that followed, and it is worth slowing down on this specific moment, because the context surrounding it changes the entire weight of what Sanders did today. Standing tall in the pocket, completely composed, Sanders delivered a strike to Denzel Boston for a touchdown. Clean release, precise ball placement, perfect timing. On the surface, that sounds like a nice practice rep, a good moment in a long training camp day. But here is what that surface description leaves out entirely. That completion came directly over Denzel Ward, Cleveland's own starting cornerback, a player who just received a significant contract extension from this organization because they believe he is one of the better corners in the entire league. Not one of the better corners on this roster. One of the better corners in the National Football League, period. When you are throwing touchdowns over that caliber of competition in a genuine quarterback evaluation, you are not padding your numbers against guys who are going to be watching games from their couches in 3 weeks. You are proving something real against legitimate professional talent. And the reason this specific connection matters beyond just the single play itself is what it tells you about the larger developing story between Sanders and Denzel Boston throughout this entire camp. Boston has been building a reputation as this offense's genuine #1 receiver at a genuinely remarkable pace for a young player still finding his footing at the professional level. Day after day throughout these early weeks of camp, Boston has been winning contested reps, making the difficult catches look routine, and establishing himself as the kind of weapon that changes how a defensive coordinator has to approach game planning against this offense. When your top receiver is consistently beating the other team's best cornerback on a repeated basis, that is not a fluke sequence of events. Flukes do not repeat themselves with that kind of regularity across multiple practices. What repeats itself is real ability, real chemistry built through real repetition. And the connection Sanders and Boston have been developing throughout this camp is starting to look like exactly that. Something genuine. Something that could be genuinely dangerous when these two players are operating at full speed in a real game environment, with real stakes on the line. From there, Sanders kept the rhythm moving with another accurate strike, this one finding Casey Washington, showing off the same clean ball placement and confident delivery that has been the signature characteristic of his best moments throughout this camp. Not forcing throws, not happy feet in the pocket under simulated pressure. just a quarterback playing with real conviction and real timing, putting the ball where only his receiver can get it, and doing it on a consistent enough basis that you stop viewing it as hot streaks and start viewing it as a baseline standard. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it connects directly to why today's performance carries the weight it does in the larger context of this competition. When Sanders has been at his sharpest throughout this camp, the ball comes out of his hand with a decisiveness that you cannot manufacture and cannot teach to a player who does not already have it naturally. You either see the field at that speed and process information at that level, or you do not. And today, against the toughest defensive look this roster can offer, that quality showed up unmistakably from the very first throw of practice to the last. That matters specifically because the criticism you hear most consistently from people who are skeptical of Sanders, and skepticism is fair. This is professional football, and skepticism should be the default until a player proves otherwise, is that the level of competition at Colorado was not representative of what he would face in the...
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
National Football League. And that is a completely reasonable thing to wonder about a college quarterback making the jump to the pros. But you cannot level that specific critique at what he did today. Denzel Ward is not a Mountain West cornerback. He is not a backup getting a shot. He is the kind of player teams build their entire secondary around, and Sanders threw a touchdown over him. That is the only response that actually matters when someone questions whether the competition level you faced in college is translating to the professional game. And what he built on top of that opening statement throw only made the picture clearer as the day continued. By the time day 11 of Browns training camp wrapped up completely, the numbers were sitting there in plain sight for anybody willing to actually look at them honestly rather than through whatever narrative lens they walked into the day already carrying. Sanders finished 16 of 23 in 11 on 11 team drills, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, working the entire day with the first-team offense against the first-team defense. Watson finished 15 of 22, 2 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, working throughout the day with the second-team unit. Now here is the thing about those two stat lines sitting next to each other. On the surface, if you glance at them quickly without adding any additional context at all, they look almost identical. Both quarterbacks completed over 65% of their attempts. Neither quarterback threw an interception. Both found the end zone multiple times. If you were building a narrative designed to suggest that this competition is essentially even, that there is no meaningful gap between these two players based on today's evidence, those raw numbers give you just enough surface material to construct that argument. But the moment you add the one piece of context that every single person covering this team knows, and every single person reading practice reports should be talking about loudly, the entire picture shifts completely. Sanders put up those numbers against the starting defense. Watson put up those numbers against the second unit. That is not a minor footnote buried at the bottom of the practice report. That is the central fact that determines how every single number in that stat line should actually be interpreted by anyone trying to seriously evaluate this quarterback competition. The quality of competition you face in a practice environment is not a small variable you can reasonably set aside when drawing conclusions. It is often the most important variable of all, because football is fundamentally a game decided by whether your talent can beat the other team's talent on any given play. And the talent Sanders was facing today was the best this team has on its roster. Full stop. Think about what it actually means to go 16 of 23 with 3 touchdowns and no turnovers against a defense that includes Denzel Ward, players who are going to be starting meaningful professional football games very soon. Players whose entire professional purpose is to stop exactly what Sanders was trying to do. That is not a completion percentage built on easy underneath throws against coverage that was not really contesting the routes. That is a quarterback operating efficiently and decisively against real professional resistance. And then consider that Watson's identical-looking stat line was built against a second unit that, while talented enough to compete for roster spots, is simply not the same level of challenge. That gap in competition quality does not make Watson's day bad. 15 of 22 with 2 scores and no picks is a clean, respectable day by any reasonable standard. But it absolutely does mean that presenting those 2 stat lines as though they represent equally weighted evidence.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
Evidence in the same competition is either lazy analysis or something less charitable than lazy analysis. Here is the sharper version of that point stated as directly as possible. Given the gap in competition level between what Sanders faced and what Watson faced today, you could make a completely reasonable argument that the raw numbers actually undersell how much better Sanders' day was by a meaningful margin. Because producing the same surface-level efficiency against significantly harder competition is not equivalent performance. It is demonstrably superior performance dressed up in numbers that look similar, if you do not stop to ask the most important question. Who were they throwing against? The fact that this question is not being asked loudly and consistently in every corner of Cleveland sports media right now is itself part of the story. And speaking of that story, there was a local radio conversation today that walked straight into the middle of all of it with a level of honesty and clarity that you do not always get in professional sports media coverage. What those 2 hosts said on air today is going to change how you think about everything surrounding this competition. Before we go any further, this is exactly the kind of coverage you subscribe to Gridiron Ground for. Not surface-level stat recaps, not recycled takes dressed up to sound original. The full picture, the context that actually changes what the numbers mean, and the conversations happening inside Cleveland sports media that tell you more about the real state of this situation than any single practice report ever could. If you are not subscribed yet, right now is the moment. Because what is coming next is the part of today's story that genuinely matters beyond just the box score. There was a local Cleveland radio exchange today that, once you hear it laid out completely and in full context, is going to crystallize exactly why so many Browns fans feel like they are watching 2 completely different competitions. The one happening on the actual practice field, and the one being described to them through certain corners of the media. One host opened the conversation by pointing out something that is genuinely difficult to explain away with normal training camp narrative fluctuation. Just 6 days before today's practice, the consensus take on air in Cleveland was that Deshaun Watson was borderline unplayable. That specific word came up not from a random social media account, not from an anonymous blogger with an axe to grind, but from a credible Cleveland media voice describing what he personally watched on a Tuesday practice. Unplayable, his word, his eyes, his assessment in real time. The following Wednesday, Watson had a better day. The same host acknowledged that honestly and gave Watson credit for it on air without hedging. A genuinely nice day. But he was also careful to say something important in that same breath. One good practice sandwiched between rough ones does not build a legitimate case. It needs to be strung together across multiple consecutive days before it earns any real weight in an honest evaluation. Then this host left the building for a stretch, covering other things, normal professional life, and when he came back several days later, he found the entire media narrative surrounding this competition had apparently done a complete 180. Watson was not just having a better camp. Based on how certain coverage was framing things, Watson was apparently a transformed quarterback ready to lead this franchise. And the host's genuine on-air reaction was essentially this: "What exactly happened while I was gone?" Because the practice notes I was reading every single day while I was away did not describe that story at all. That reaction is important because it is not the reaction of someone who had checked out and missed a dramatic turning point. It is the reaction of someone who had been tracking the detailed daily information closely and found that the conclusions certain people were drawing did not match the evidence those same daily notes were actually providing.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
His co-host's response to that confusion is where this conversation gets genuinely fascinating, because rather than defending the narrative shift or explaining it away as normal training camp fluctuation, he went deeper. He pointed out that this did not happen over those 6 days specifically. It had been building quietly for a long time before those 6 days even arrived. National insiders had been floating signals for months suggesting this organization intended to hand Watson the starting job, regardless of how the competition actually unfolded on the field. Reports surfaced well before spring practices that Watson already had the inside track, before either quarterback had thrown a single live rep against real defensive pressure, before a single practice snap had been taken. The co-host's point was that the sudden dramatic narrative shift the first host noticed was not the product of a few good Watson practices. It was the product of a slow-building background story that had finally found enough surface-level material to justify going public, with a conclusion that certain people apparently already wanted to reach. And Browns fans who had been paying close attention to all of it felt exactly what both of those hosts were feeling on air today. The growing suspicion that the competition they were being told was genuine might be something more complicated than that. The rabbit hole goes deeper than either host initially let on. Here is the part of this story that goes beyond individual practice days and box scores and radio conversations, because what both of those hosts were circling around without fully naming it directly is something that requires a little more digging to understand completely. The Cleveland Browns have built a very specific public identity as an organization. They talk about data. They talk about analytics. They talk about making decisions grounded in objective evaluation rather than emotional attachment to past investments or reputational considerations. That is the brand they have carefully constructed and publicly promoted. A front office that follows the evidence, wherever it leads rather than letting sunk cost or narrative pressure push them toward conclusions the numbers do not actually support. And yet, Deshaun Watson has not played consistently winning level football in approximately 6 years. That is not a hot take designed to generate engagement. That is the factual record of what has happened on the field when Watson has been the starting quarterback in recent professional football. The production simply has not been there at the level required to justify the kind of contract commitment the Browns made when they brought him to Cleveland in one of the most aggressive and controversial quarterback acquisitions in recent league history. Jimmy Haslam, the owner of this franchise, the man who signed off on that acquisition, has publicly described the entire situation using the phrase, "a swing and a miss." Those are his words, not a frustrated fan's words, not an anonymous source inside the building. The owner of the Cleveland Browns standing in front of microphones and cameras and calling his own quarterback situation a swing and a miss. That is an extraordinary level of public acknowledgement from the very top of an organization. And here is where the data-driven brand starts to create a serious credibility problem for the Browns. Because if you are genuinely a data-driven organization, and your own owner is publicly describing your starting quarterback as a swing and a miss, and the on-field production across 6 years supports that assessment completely, then the logical conclusion of your own stated organizational philosophy points clearly away from handing Watson this job again. The data does not make a case for Watson, it makes a case against him. So when national insiders start floating pre-camp signals that Watson is going to get the job regardless of competition outcomes, and those signals arrive before either quarterback has thrown a single live practice rep, the natural question every rational Browns fan has been asking for months becomes almost impossible to ignore. Why? What data are they looking at that justifies this particular conclusion? Because the data that is publicly visible does not seem to be pointing there. The co-host on that radio show made a point here that deserves real attention. He said he came into this offseason genuinely believing this organization would never put Browns fans through the Watson as starter scenario again, precisely because of their stated commitment to data-driven decision-making. He believed in the brand. He trusted that an organization...
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
...which publicly promotes objective evaluation would look at 6 years of declining production and an owner's public swing and a miss assessment and draw the obvious conclusion. But what he has watched unfold instead is a competition where the pre-camp narrative seemed to point in Watson's direction before it started, where a casual sideline decision about rep rotation created a dramatic overnight narrative shift, and where a few practices described repeatedly as merely passable by people watching with their own eyes apparently generated enough momentum to treat the competition as functionally decided. That gap between what a genuinely data-driven evaluation of this situation should produce and what the surrounding narrative has actually been building toward is exactly the gap that is driving the frustration you hear from Cleveland fans when they talk about this competition. They are not frustrated because they are irrational. They are frustrated because they can see the math clearly, and the math does not add up in the direction certain corners of the media keep trying to push it. But there is one person in this entire situation who has at least been willing to address the mechanics of what is actually happening directly. And what he said is worth examining very carefully. Todd Monken addressed the rep rotation situation directly when reporters pushed him on it. And fairness demands that you hear his actual explanation in full rather than just the second-hand filtered version that tends to spread fastest when a controversy like this gains momentum. His account of what happened is, genuinely, more straightforward than the surrounding drama might suggest. And it is also, simultaneously, more revealing than he perhaps intended it to be. Monkin said that Sanders was taking first-team reps during the Saturday walkthrough session. He confirmed that he fully expected that arrangement to continue from there, Sanders with the starters, Watson continuing with the second unit in that particular rotation. But as he was walking off the field after that session, people within the building pointed something out to him. Sanders had been accumulating extra first-team reps over the preceding stretch of practices compared to Watson. The rep count had drifted out of balance, and his response to that information by his own telling was simple. Essentially, sure, let's flip it, and the next week we'll go back the other way. That was it. That was the explanation for the moment that sent Cleveland sports media into a multi-day narrative spiral about whether this competition was actually open, or whether the organization was quietly steering it toward a predetermined conclusion. A casual sideline conversation about rep balance on the walk off the practice field. Now, there are two very different ways to read that explanation depending on how charitable you want to be toward the organization's intentions here. The charitable reading is that Monkin is telling the truth, that this genuinely was a routine logistical adjustment designed to keep the evaluation fair by ensuring both quarterbacks get comparable looks at comparable rep counts, that there is no larger conspiracy here, just a head coach managing a complicated two-quarterback situation, trying to keep both players sharp and both evaluation samples balanced. That is a completely reasonable thing to do, and a completely reasonable explanation to give. The less charitable reading is that the casualness of this explanation is itself part of the problem. Because if you are running a legitimate quarterback competition with real franchise-altering stakes, the mechanism by which one quarterback loses his first team reps should not be a sideline conversation about rep balance as you are walking off the field after a walkthrough. It should be a deliberate, planned, communicated decision with a clear rationale that both quarterbacks and their representatives understand in advance. The casualness of the explanation does not make it sinister, but it does make it feel less like a carefully managed evaluation and more like an improvised reaction to a logistical observation. Monkin pushed back directly on the idea that any of this proves the competition is secretly decided. His point was that as long as reps are being actively shared and rotated, by definition, that is still an open competition, not a settled question dressed up to look open. He compared the rotational decisions around the quarterback position to how the staff is handling other position battles across the roster, referencing other players as examples of normal day-to-day rotation that should not be read as permanent declarations about final roster choices. He was also blunt about something else. He said he does not feel obligated to pre-announce or publicly justify every rotational decision to the media before it happens. That is his prerogative as the head coach, and it is a completely fair position to take. Head coaches are not required to run their practice scheduling decisions through a public approval process. But here is the tension that Monkin's explanation does not fully resolve, and I think it is important to name it directly. The Saturday in question, by multiple credible accounts including Monkin's own retelling, involved a publicly stated plan for Sanders to get first-team reps that then did not happen as stated. And when the head coach's own pre-practice public statements do not match what actually occurs on the practice field, the gap between those two things is going to generate exactly the kind of scrutiny and speculation it generated. That is not unfair media behavior. That is the natural consequence of a public statement that did not match the public reality. What those radio hosts noticed was that gap, and what they said about it next cut straight to the heart of everything. Here is the argument that the first radio host put on the table, and I want to make sure you understand exactly how sharp it actually is, because it is easy to let it slide past as just another frustrated media take if you are not paying close enough attention to the specific logic underneath it. He had been reading the detailed daily practice notes the entire time he was away from the building, not just scanning headlines, not catching second-hand summaries from reporters who were summarizing other reporters, the actual detailed notes, bullet point by bullet point, the kind of granular reporting that gives you the texture of what actually happened on the field rather than just the narrative someone decided to build around it afterward. And what those notes described about Watson's practices during the stretch where the narrative flipped most dramatically was a word that kept coming up repeatedly: passable. Not spectacular, not dominant, not a quarterback who had clearly found something and was now operating at a different level than before. Passable, acceptable, competent without being impressive. The kind of performances that keep a player in the conversation without doing anything that meaningfully advances his case. And the host's precise point, stated plainly and without excessive drama, was this: if passable is genuinely the threshold that flipped public narrative from Watson was unplayable on Tuesday to Watson, has apparently run away with this competition by the following Monday, that mathematical leap makes no sense whatsoever when you examine it honestly. Think about what that sequence actually looks like when you lay it out in order. One Tuesday, Watson cannot throw the football effectively by the honest assessment of someone watching with their own eyes. A Wednesday looks better, enough to give credit for a genuine bounce-back day, but with the explicit caveat that one good practice means nothing until it is followed by more good practices. Then a stretch of practices that generate the word passable from people tracking it closely. And somehow, the conclusion that certain media corners landed on was not Watson had a decent few days. The competition remains genuinely open. It was Watson is apparently the guy. That is not a logical progression built on a genuine accumulation of evidence. That is a conclusion that was apparently sitting there waiting for any excuse at all to come out, and passable turned out to be excuse enough. The co-host added something to this point that I think is the most important piece of context in this entire conversation. He talked about the concept of narrative gravity, the idea that once a story starts moving in a particular direction, especially when that direction is being pushed by national insiders with connections inside an organization, it develops a kind of momentum that is very difficult to reverse even when the day-to-day evidence does not actually support the trajectory. That is exactly what appears to have happened here. The pre-camp national insider signals pointed toward Watson. Local reports before spring practices echoed that direction. And when Watson had a few days that could charitably be described as passable rather than genuinely impressive, those days got drafted into service of a narrative that was already moving and needed fuel to keep going. Meanwhile, Sanders was delivering performances throughout this camp that would have generated enormous excitement if they had come from virtually any other quarterback in virtually any other situation. The Denzel Ward touchdown throw today is not a minor footnote. That is an impressive professional-level play against impressive professional-level competition. And the fact that it arrived on the same day that this radio conversation was happening, the same day that the passable equals frontrunner math was being examined out loud and found to be completely nonsensical, makes the timing feel almost cinematic. Because today was not just a good practice for Sanders. Today was specifically and directly the answer to the passable problem. Not passable, 3 touchdowns, 0 turnovers, first team defense. The exact kind of performance that the most honest corners of Cleveland media had been saying Watson would need to string together to genuinely earn this job. Delivered instead by the quarterback, who had just spent the better part of a week watching his first team reps disappear based on a casual sideline conversation. Watson also had something to say today, and fairness requires giving him his honest due. This is the part of the conversation that is easy to skip if you have already made up your mind about where this competition should land. And I understand the temptation to skip it, because the Sanders versus Watson story has generated a level of tribal intensity in Cleveland that makes nuanced, honest evaluation feel almost like a betrayal of whichever side of this debate you have planted your flag on. But here at Gridiron Ground, the standard we hold ourselves to is the same standard we are applying to everyone else in this conversation. If you want the honest picture, you have to take the whole picture, including the parts that complicate the cleaner narrative. Watson went 15 of 22 today, 2 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, working with the second unit throughout the day's team drills. That is a clean football day by any reasonable measure you want to apply to it. No mistakes, no turnovers in situations where turnovers can derail a quarterback's momentum and credibility simultaneously. 2 scoring connections that demonstrate he is capable of finding the end zone efficiently when the protection holds and the reads are clear. And a completion percentage that suggests the ball placement and accuracy that have been inconsistent at various points earlier in this camp were at least functioning properly today. Credit where it is actually due. That is a respectable practice day. And it matters to say that out loud directly because the honest concern from Cleveland media, and honestly the honest concern from anyone watching this competition with clear eyes, is not that Watson is categorically incapable of having a good day. He clearly is capable of having a good day. Today was a good day. The Wednesday that the first radio host acknowledged and gave credit for in real time was apparently a good day too. The concern is something more specific and more difficult to resolve through individual good days viewed in isolation. The concern is consistency. The concern is whether what shows up on the good days can be reliably reproduced on the following day, and the day after that, and the day after that, across a full practice week, and eventually across a full preseason game, and eventually across a full regular season. Because that sustained, reliable reproducibility is what separates a quarterback who can play football from a quarterback who is actually ready to be the starter for a professional franchise with legitimate playoff aspirations. And the second part of the concern is the competition-level question that keeps coming back to the surface, no matter how many times the surrounding narrative tries to set it aside. Watson's clean days and his passable days have come predominantly against second-unit competition. The performance gap between the first and second-unit defenses in professional football training camp is meaningful. It is not the difference between playing and not playing, but it is a real gradient of difficulty that should factor into any honest evaluation of how these numbers should be weighted. The question that every single honest observer of this competition has been circling around for weeks now, and that today's events brought into sharper focus than ever, is whether Watson can reproduce his better days when the competition level matches what Sanders faced today, against the players who are going to be starting real meaningful football games, against the defensive backs and pass rushers who get paid specifically to make quarterbacks uncomfortable and make them make mistakes. That question does not have a definitive answer yet. It is not fair to say Watson cannot do it, because he has not been tested against that competition consistently enough for the data to give you a clear conclusion. But it is also not fair to hand him this job based on days that have mostly ranged from unplayable to passable to occasionally good against second-unit competition. What fairness actually requires here is exactly what Todd Monken says is still happening: real competitive reps, real evaluation, against real competition on both sides of the ball. And the next truly critical moment in that process is coming faster than you might think. What happens on Wednesday could shift the entire conversation once again. The next genuine checkpoint in this competition arrives Wednesday, and it carries a different kind of weight than what we have seen through most of this camp so far, because Wednesday brings something that has been absent from the evaluation up to this point: pads. Sanders is scheduled to get his next stretch of first-team reps specifically in a fully padded practice environment. And if you have been following training camp football long enough to understand what that shift actually means for quarterback evaluation, you know why this particular practice carries a different level of significance than the shorts and helmets sessions that have dominated the earlier weeks of camp. Shorts and helmets practice tells you a tremendous amount of useful information about a quarterback: the timing of his releases, the accuracy of his ball placement under simulated pressure, his ability to read coverages and process information at professional speed, his chemistry with receivers, and his command of the offense. All of those things show up in shorts and helmets practice, and all of them are genuinely valuable data points in a real quarterback evaluation. But here is what shorts and helmets practice cannot fully replicate, no matter how well it is designed, and no matter how hard the players are competing within those limitations. It cannot replicate physicality. It cannot replicate the disruption that a genuine pass rush creates when those rushers are actually allowed to hit the quarterback. It cannot replicate the natural hesitation and decision-making adjustment that happens when a quarterback knows the next bad decision could end with him on the ground. Padded practice introduces all of those variables back into the equation, and how a quarterback navigates those variables, how his timing holds up when the pocket is collapsing with real physical consequences, how his decision-making speed holds up when he knows the rush is coming with genuine intent, is where the evaluation gets genuinely predictive of real game performance. For Sanders specifically, the critique you hear from people who want to be fair but still have questions about his readiness is almost always some version of this: his college competition was not representative of what he is going to face in the National Football League. The pace is different. The speed of the game is different. And that gap is going to show up under padded conditions against professional pass rushers. in a way it might not show up as clearly in a controlled shorts and helmets environment. Wednesday is the moment when that specific critique either gets answered or gets louder. If Sanders carries today's precision and decisiveness and confidence into a fully padded environment against Cleveland's starting defense, the honest case for him leading this offense becomes difficult to argue against based on the actual available evidence. Because at that point, you are not just talking about a quarterback who looks sharp in controlled conditions. You are talking about a quarterback who has demonstrated the ability to perform at a high level against the most challenging conditions this team's training camp can create. And Watson's next rotation of first-team reps is coming too, which means the same test applies equally on the other side of this competition. If Watson can string together multiple genuinely impressive days in a row, not passable, not acceptable, genuinely impressive, against the starting defense when his turn comes back around, then Monkin's description of this competition as genuinely open earns real credibility. Because here is the honest truth about where this competition actually stands heading into the week. The preseason games against Chicago and Buffalo are the real proving ground. Those are the moments when the evaluation stops being about practice reports and radio conversations and insider signals and starts being about what happens when real football is played with real consequences against teams that are actively trying to win. Every rep between now and those preseason games is preparation for that evaluation. And Sanders just served notice today, loudly and clearly, that he intends to keep making that evaluation as difficult as possible to resolve in Watson's favor. The conversation is not over. If anything, it is just getting started. Here is where everything lands after you strip away the noise and look at what actually happened today. Shedeur Sanders got his first team reps back, and the moment he got them back, he delivered 3 touchdowns, 0 turnovers, and a performance against the starting defense that represents arguably his most complete day of this entire training camp. That is not a coincidence. That is a quarterback who came into today with something to prove, and proved it as directly and loudly as the available opportunity allowed him to. The radio conversation that happened around today's practice told a story that goes well beyond one good practice. It told the story of a narrative machine that was apparently preloaded and ready to fire the moment any excuse at all arrived to justify the conclusion it wanted to reach. Passable practices became frontrunner status. A casual sideline decision became a multi-day controversy. And through all of it, the actual on-field evidence kept pointing in a direction that certain corners of the coverage were clearly uncomfortable sitting with. The data-driven organization and its owner's own public assessment of this situation say one thing. The quiet background signals from national insiders have been saying something else entirely. And what the practice field has been saying, most clearly and most consistently throughout this camp, belongs to number 2. The competition is open. The field is speaking. The only question left is whether anyone in the building with the actual power to make this decision is truly listening. Drop your take below. Is this competition real, or is the ending already written? Because here at Gridiron Ground, we are not done watching, and neither should you be.